We're going to have more time at the very end to have questions on any topic, depending on how much time we have left. So we'll go back to these, or you can ask some others. But otherwise, our next part is going to focus on what we know and what we don't know, and then data we have and don't have that we need to be sure that we are sustainably managing our water resources. And so we have two other speakers now who will each speak for about 10 minutes. And then again, we'll have time for questions and also for you to share your thoughts. And so you can type in the Q&A box at any time. So our first speaker is Ginger Davis, who's a research hydrogeologist at the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. And she is going to talk about groundwater, these questions, and she'll be followed by Keith Cherkauer, who is a professor of agricultural and biological engineering and also director of the Indiana Water Resources Research Center. And he's going to focus on surface water. That's how they've split it up. And thanks to both of you for putting together, without an in-depth survey, we know that you haven't done a great deal of research on this, but putting together what we know and what we need to know. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, Jane. I think I need control of the slides unless you want me to just say next slide. Thank you. So again, my name's Ginger Davis. I'm a hydrogeologist with the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. The survey is a research institute that conducts research, surveys the state, collects and preserves geological specimens and data, and disseminates information to contribute to mitigation of geological hazards and the wise stewardship of energy, mineral, and water resources in Indiana. So it's my honor today to talk a bit about the work we're doing, and I believe it all comes down to the balance of water within our state. I like to start with our conceptual model, the high-level view of water resources in the state, and I love to utilize the new water balance or water cycle image that USGS puts together. That indicates the different pools and fluxes, or what I like to say as storage and movement of water through the cycle. If you look at this image in detail, I encourage you, when you're thinking about Indiana, to focus on the area that is not within the mountain ranges, but more of these flatlands where we see agricultural use and industrial use of our waters, but also the groundwater soil moisture system. Groundwater and soil moisture being those storage areas and pools where we hold water, and then the evapotranspiration, agricultural use, groundwater recharge as the movement of water from the different reservoirs into different places within the water cycle. So one of the researches that we do here at the survey is keep an eye on the water balance. We are instrumenting the state with different hydroclimatic monitoring, which includes soil moisture and recharge to get a handle on recharge. We also monitor precipitation, wind speed, temperature, and humidity to get an idea of moisture in the atmosphere and where it's moving to, whether up or down. And then also groundwater and groundwater wells. So when we look at a water balance, we're basically accounting for where water moves through the system. And I like to say this is our fund banking system, right? So this is where water goes to be stored in our groundwater system. That's the bank. And then the withdrawals and deposits that are made through either pumping or atmospheric withdrawal from evaporation, or then deposits through recharge and infiltration through the soil moisture. So this is all based on our geological foundation and the geological framework that makes up our system that water flows through when it hits the ground. I'm specifically wanted to point out the area that we're speaking about today. So I pulled in some old research that some of the folks here at the Geological Survey, when we were part of DNR, fun known fact, along with some of the professors there at Purdue University, and some division water folks like Mark Bash and Ryan Miller. And so this was a research that was done back in the 80s and 90s as to look at the Tays River Valley, which is a deep buried bedrock channel underneath our modern day glacial units. And so a couple cross sections were made by these researchers to take a look at the different types of units that were below the ground in these areas, and the different prograde and recession of glacial sequences within these to make up different units within the ground. So we have a buried bedrock channel that is primarily filled in this part of the state, which you can see. This is the kind of north-south transect along the western edge of West Lafayette and Lafayette. And this indicates that in the deep bedrock system, we have a valley-filled aquifer with coarse gravels and sands that are embedded with some silts and loams. And we think about these coarse gravels and sands as being our aquifers. This is where water can move through the groundwater. This is our storage area for the water within the ground, because there's plenty of pore space between these sediments for water to move. And these are capped off by tills, which are a mixture of different sediment sizes that can cap and kind of resist the movement of water, and also protect from contamination. So this north-south transect kind of indicates that down deep into our system is some of these coarse sands and gravels, whereas interbedded, discontinuous, intertilled sands and gravels do occur in the upper units, but are very discontinuous and limited in dimensions, both laterally and horizontally, laterally and vertically. So here is a big picture of this valley, this deep valley that runs through the northern portion of the state, and USGS and DNR cooperated it back in the day to collect some core samples and do some analysis. And you can see over on the Ohio side, it's pretty much the fine materials, which do not allow for water flow, whereas to the east, you have much more coarse materials that do allow for more aquifer storage. Specifically in the area of Tippecanoe County from Benton through Carroll, we can see how these materials were deposited through various different drill holes that are provided in that area. I kind of colored them so that it would be a little bit easier to see, with the gravels being gravels and sands being our two aquifer systems that can be relied upon. Now these units these units showcase how thick the units can be over on the Illinois border, but they do taper off as you move to the east. And in the West Lafayette area, the valley has cut through some of those capping units to expose this deeper system a bit more, and so it has more readily available to that water. Another project that has been conducted in Indiana is the potentiometric surface maps that DNR participated in, and I did as well when I was back at DNR. And this kind of shows the direction of water movement across these lines. You can think of them as contours for water. And so in the Tippecanoe area, water is moving from the southeast to the northwest to that Wabash River Valley system. And the contours are fairly narrow spaced, so you've got quite a steep gradient. Down just adjacent is Boone County, where our Lebanon area is, and you can see that Lebanon is on a high groundwater system, and so water is now moving in multiple directions in the groundwater. But these are all part of more shallow system where private wells are located, and maybe does not inform as much on that deeper bedrock system, especially since the deeper bedrock system does not lie below the Lebanon area. So we do use monitoring wells to try and capture the information from these areas and try and capture data as to what groundwater levels are doing. I would say that, and based on some statistics that USGS and others have done, that we do not have enough groundwater monitoring wells, especially at various depths. This image here is a map of our groundwater monitoring wells within the state. The smaller diameter circles and squares are shallow, either bedrock or unconsolidated glacial or alluvial materials. And the larger and darker squares are the deeper. So you can see there is a very wide spattering of different depths and different types of wells, but not enough to accurately characterize our aquifers within the state or monitor them. Some of the monitoring that has been done, this is one of the aquifers that is monitoring that deep bedrock Taze system. And you can see, at least since the real-time monitoring in 2007 has been conducted, that the trend of the water is declining, with obviously some droughts impacting that. We love to see that rebound and recharge of the aquifer of the water coming back up after droughts, but we are seeing a steady decline in those water levels. Two of the other monitoring wells in this area are some of the middle and shallower aquifers. So this is one of the shallow aquifers. This would be more where a private well would be located. And we aren't seeing that same trend here, or the limited data that we have available for the middle aquifer there. So the last slide I want to talk about is these consequences of overwithdrawal. There are many, and they have been misunderstood and not characterized within the state. And I'd like to impress on you the importance of characterizing these things before we overwithdraw any aquifer. The reduced capacity for future needs, subsidence or settling or release of pressure from water will cause sediments to compact, reducing the long-term capacity of aquifers for storage. Oxidation changes can change the chemistry of the aquifer and encourage some releases that may be harmful for human health. You can also have lowering of water levels that impact the critical infrastructure of private wells, lowering of lake levels or changes in streams to go from perennial to possibly dry streams. And with that, I think it's a good time to turn it over to the surface water talk that Keith's going to give. And I'll take questions after our two are done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. So I'm Keith Cherkauer, professor in the School of Agricultural and Biological Engineering at Purdue University, and also the director of the Indiana Water Resources Research Center. And I think Ginger gave me a nice introduction, working from underground and the aquifers, and I'm going to try to tie it together by talking about surface conditions. And we've seen these plots of well, Mark showed these. This is surface water withdrawal, significant water withdrawal facilities across the state, surface water in the middle, groundwater on the right-hand side. I've also brought in a population map for Indiana, so you can see a lot of the intensity for water withdrawals is related to population, but also agriculture in the northern parts of the state. The little orange squares that have now popped in are kind of the area that we are talking about as far as this proposed Lebanon LEAP transfer. Switching to here, again, now we're looking at groundwater and surface water monitoring. So these are 30-year trends from 1992 through 2022. So we've talked about some of these locations already. Whoops, wrong. Gotta remember to push the button. There we go. Again, the orange square is showing what the area we're talking about. And then here we have the Benton 4 well that Ginger was just talking about, as well as the Tippecanoe 18. So you can see Benton 4 has a downward trend in water level, water availability. Tippecanoe 18, upward trend. They are very close together when we look at this map of the state. But as Ginger pointed out, they're at different depths and in different parts of the aquifer system. If we look at the surface water, there is a gauge here on the Wabash River at Lafayette, and there is one here at Covington. So we're going to look at those when we look at the potential changes to Wabash River flow with the proposed level of withdrawals. And you can see that the surface water in general is increasing. There are some areas in the northwest part of the state that are decreasing, but much of the state is seeing increases or has seen increases in surface water over the last 30 years, whereas groundwater is very much a mixed signal. Oops, oh, there we go. I had those labeled too. So to do this part of the discussion, I want to approach this by looking at scenarios for withdrawals. So what I'm going to talk about in the coming slides is an analysis that assumes that all of the water for these proposed withdrawals is going to be pulled directly from the Wabash River. Okay, the proposed riverbank infiltration system that we're talking about will really only draw a fraction of its water from the river. The rest will come from the underlying aquifer. We won't really know what percentage of river versus aquifer is being pulled until they put test wells in and take measurements. So this is really kind of getting at kind of a worst case scenario for the rivers involved. I will point out too that estimating the impact on the local aquifers in a similar method, or using a kind of a similar methodology, requires far more detailed data that we have, and so I can't do that for can't do the same kind of analysis. The scenarios that are evaluated as part of this presentation are between 5 and 100 million gallons a day being withdrawn from the Wabash River upstream and downstream of the transfer location. So LEAP Lebanon is most likely going to be transferring between 5 and 10 million gallons per day, because that's what most industrial high capacity systems are pulling. But if you looked at, say, 10 such sites, you would get between 50 and 100 million gallons a day. And I know that there have been some newspaper reports saying that 100 million gallons a day would be moved for this LEAP Lebanon. So therefore, I am looking at 4 scenarios: 5, 10, 50, and 100 million gallons a day. I'm going to start. So again, we have Wabash River at Lafayette is going to be upstream of the proposed withdrawal location. Wabash River at Covington is downstream. And I'm just going to put this up. This is the last 30 years of daily stream flow. And yes, the stream flow with 100 million gallons a day, 50, 10, and 5 are all on this plot. And you really can't see the difference. Right, so we are not talking about a substantial overall removal of water from the Wabash River, even if all of this was pulled directly from the surface water. If we look at it as a percentage of current flow, then 5 million gallons per day pulled from the Wabash River at Lafayette. It's more than 0%, but is not very big. If we get up to the 100 million gallons a day, we are getting close to 2% of annual flow over this 30-year period is being taken out of the Wabash River and transferred to Lebanon. If we move downstream to Covington, where the river is bigger, we're under 1.75%. So again, not a huge amount of the average annual amount of water is going to be transferred. Okay, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect. Right, so how and when might these transfers affect flow in the Wabash? In order to see that and quantify that, we really need to consider extreme low flows. And so I'm going to do that by using what's called the average minimum 7-day consecutive flow, or 7 consecutive days of low flow that occurs once every 10 years. This is also referred to as a 7Q10, and it is a threshold used by a lot of agencies for identifying extremely low flows and those that pose an ecological risk. In particular, Indiana has code that when the river flow is below its 7Q10, normal water quality standards may cease to be applicable. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but it is such a low flow that regular monitoring and concerns about water quality may be put to the side for a period of time. So if we look at days over the last 30 years when the Wabash River has been below 7Q10, in the observed record at Lafayette, that's 69 days, and at Covington, that's 74 days. If we start pulling out 5 million gallons a day, Lafayette moves from 69 to 73 days. Covington stays about the same, much larger quantity of water there. As we move up in the amounts of withdrawn, if we get up to 100 million gallons a day, we're about twice as many days that fall below the current 7Q10 level, and almost as many at Covington. And if we look at how those days are distributed across the last 30 years, right? 2012 was a big drought year. We had a lot of days in the observed record that were under the 7Q10, almost over 40 at Lafayette. If we pull 5 million gallons a day out of the river, that hardly makes a dent in that. If we pull 10, we do see that we get a couple extra days. If we're doing 50 or 100, doesn't quite double the number of days under the 7Q10, but it does change the number. And the same with many of these others. And so there are years when if we were withdrawing 100 million gallons a day every day, that we would actually be under the 7Q10 in a year when it wouldn't have been naturally. So there is an impact for that withdrawal if we are considering extreme low flows. The other thing that we need to consider with this process, because this is a transfer from one watershed to another, is that the industrial use, that once the industrial use is done, that water is going to be returned to local surface waters. Industrial use is mostly non-consumptive, which means that most of that water will still be present when its use is done, which means it's going to be returned to nearby water bodies. Irrigation would be an example of a water use that is mostly consumptive, where most of that water is not going to be returned because it has been evaporated and used to grow plants. Return water is most likely to be added to local surface waters, streams, lakes, and reservoirs, because recharging aquifers is difficult. So therefore, when the water is pulled from the Wabash and taken down to Sugar Creek or White River, it is most likely to be returned to the surface water system. So again, the scenarios I'm going to show in the next couple of slides assume that 100% of the water transfer is returned to streams near Lebanon or near Indianapolis. And I know our next speaker in the next section is going to talk about how much water is actually consumed in industrial processes, so I'm not going to get into that, but I'm going to assume 100% is being returned.
Okay, so we just have a minute or two, Keith.
Sorry. It is our worst case scenario. And so we are looking again, right, not many wells and not many stream flow gauges in here, but we're going to look at Sugar Creek and Eagle Creek. And so if we look at the percent of annual discharge, if we return that amount of water, Prairie Creek, which is in Lebanon, we're talking a substantial change to the amount of water in that creek, with 5 million gallons a day up to 100 million gallons a day, 350% increase in the water volume in Prairie Creek if that water is returned there. In Sugar Creek, even 100 million gallons a day, we're talking maybe addition of 25% of daily stream flow. Eagle Creek, being smaller than Sugar Creek but larger than Prairie Creek, falls in between. And then if we look at change to extreme low flows, I couldn't do counts under the 7Q10 because once we start pumping these waters into all of these rivers, the old 7Q10 is no longer valid. Nothing falls below it. So this is showing you how the observed 7Q10, which you can see for Sugar Creek and Eagle Creek because they're large enough to be displayed, are overwhelmed by what would be a new 7Q10 because that water has been transferred into the system. And then I just want to wrap up, right, to remind you that those scenarios that I presented are extremes, but they are something that we can do with the surface water system, something we cannot do with the groundwater system. That all of this is neglecting surface groundwater interactions. They are very important, but they are poorly understood in this area. My general statement, Indiana has plentiful water resources, but they are not evenly distributed. And that is why we're having these conversations about moving water from one watershed to another. And my final point, right, in order to have a better understanding of what is happening in this system, we have to have better observational records. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks to both of you for providing really a lot of information, even though you haven't had a chance to study this in depth because we haven't had, research projects. But that last point was really one of the points we wanted to make sure everybody heard, that Indiana needs more observations. So I think this really helped. I'll just pull out some of the questions. There are some really interesting and complicated questions here. Emily asked near the beginning, and this would be for Ginger. So capacity is not indicative to the amount of available water. Question mark. Is there an aquifer mapping program? Is that something you can answer, Ginger?
So yeah, aquifers have been mapped in the 2D by DNR, Division of Water, and those are great resources for us to use. But those are fairly limited on the well logs and use of well logs, which most private wells, they drill down to as soon as they find water and they place a well. And so some of the aquifers that are below those systems have not been mapped nearly as well, and we don't have as good of a data set on that. So there is some movement towards doing some hydrostratigraphy within the state, and we're looking towards that. But as resources are always limited with our agencies, that is a challenge for us.
And another question with your data, Ginger, the location for the graph of the declining aquifer levels that you showed. Can you tell us where that was? Was it far from the river, is what this person asked?
No, I appreciate that question. And actually, I think Keith bailed me out of that by putting it on his presentation, which worked out really well. It is in Benton County. And so it is not near the Wabash directly, but is down gradient of where the Taze aquifer is from Wabash. So it would be picking up any recharge from the Wabash would be seen within that Benton County well. Further downstream, and it might go into one of these other questions, is the Mohammed Taze of Illinois, which is heavily depended on. So this Benton monitoring well is upstream of that.
Okay, good to mention that because that's what another questioner asked, but I think that's a little complex. I'm going to go back to one at the top that neither of you covered at all, but I think it's a good point, so I just want to raise it. Michael says, I realize that water quantity is being discussed. However, there are circumstances where increased water withdrawal can affect water quality. Doesn't this need to be part of any discussion on water use? So I wonder if either of you want to say anything about that.
I mean, again, it's a complicated question without data. The 7Q10 analysis gets at that a little bit, because right, if you're at that extremely low flow and you're still trying to pull water out, well, and I think Mark indicated that you shouldn't be pulling water out at that point, but we haven't. I think he didn't. Nothing has gone beyond voluntary measures at this point. But no, I do agree, right? Water quality is a big concern, but we don't have the data to answer that question.
And I'll just curtail on for aquifer quality. Yes, we do not nearly have as much data for aquifer quality, except for in site-specific areas of the state. But there can be significant impacts and to the geochemistry as you lower water levels. You oxidize the system and it alters the water quality parameters.
Yeah, a lot more to be said on that one. So I think I'll just finish this section by asking what somebody asked in the registration of what data do we need to be collecting that we shouldn't be in order to analyze a new withdrawal like the one proposed for LEAP Lebanon. Would either of you care to make some statements about what we need to be collecting?
Ginger, you want to start? Or?
Sure. I think a better characterization of our aquifers by having higher density monitoring systems. If you look to other states, there's significant monitoring in Nebraska and Kansas because they had a need to. We are approaching that need as well, and so it'd be smart for us to increase our monitoring, which both DNR, USGS, and ourselves are in the process of trying to do with funds available. I also highly recommend that we put in more of the water balance stations as well, as we're trying to calculate these balances across the different atmosphere to surface water to groundwater. Having an accounting of all those is very important. So increased in those sorts of stations around the state for drought monitoring, flood prediction, things like that is also going to be highly helpful.
Do you want to add anything, Keith? Otherwise, we'll.
Right. We should maintain the stream flow gauges we have now. We shouldn't let them get shut down, and we should figure out how to do more water quality monitoring. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, great points. So this is the end of our brief scientist section. So thanks to both of you for showing us the complexity and the kind of data that we need.